They said she'd lost her mind, gave up her torque wrenches, her air compressor, even the rusted red toolbox that had been her father's just to drag home a helicopter that hadn't flown since the Reagan years. Mallory James didn't argue. She just signed the bill of sale, loaded the remains of the Hughes 300 onto a flatbed trailer, and waved goodbye to the last of her tools as they were sold off one by one to make room for something she couldn't explain. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the flatbed creaked up her gravel driveway, the town watched in silence. A girl with grease still under her fingernails hauling in a flying coffin. They whispered in parking lots and scoffed at the diner. But Mallory wasn't listening. She had already chosen silence. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is something you won't want to miss. Now, let's get started. Mallory stood at the base of the trailer, arms crossed, staring up at the helicopter like it had spoken to her in a dream. The paint was flaking, patches of moss clung to the skids, and one of the rotor blades drooped like a snapped wing. The fuselage looked more like a coffin than a cockpit, but Mallory saw more than rust. She saw possibility. She always had. The small hangar on her late father's property hadn't been used in years. It had been his workshop, his escape, and in the final months of his illness, his sanctuary. Since his passing, she couldn't bring herself to go inside. The dust on the windows was 3 seasons thick, and the lock had rusted shut. Until now, with the help of a crowbar and her shoulder, Mallory forced the doors open. Dust exploded into the air like old secrets. The space still smelled like motor oil and cedar, her father's cologne, faint but haunting. She stepped inside, her boots echoing against the concrete. The silence pressed in, familiar and heavy. That's where she would rebuild it. That would be her new garage. She watched the tow driver lower the helicopter into the hangar, with the delicacy of someone delivering a ghost. When it finally touched down, she exhaled for the first time in hours. He raised an eyebrow. "You sure this thing's not gonna kill you?" She didn't answer. Not with words. Instead, she stepped forward, placed a hand on the corroded metal, and whispered, "Let's see what you're still hiding." By nightfall, the hangar lights flickered to life, one bulb at a time. Mallory sat cross-legged beneath the open belly of the chopper, sorting through what parts remained. The instrument panel was cracked, the wires brittle, but buried in the dust and age was something sacred. This wasn't just a machine, it was a message, and she was ready to decode it even if no one else believed. The next morning, Mallory woke up sore from sleep she barely had. Her muscles ached from unloading the wreck, but it wasn't the kind of pain that begged for rest. It was the kind that made her feel alive. She brewed coffee in the same chipped pot that had outlived both her parents, then walked barefoot through dew-soaked grass to the hangar. The helicopter sat in the center of the space like a fallen monument, both intimidating and inviting. The rising sun poured through the open doors, casting a golden glow over flaking paint and cracked plexiglass. For a moment, she just stood there and looked at it. Not as a mechanic, not as a daughter. Just as a person trying to feel again. She slid her fingers across the tail boom and let her eyes trace the outlines of where a registration number had once been. The rotors, though drooping and unbalanced, still held the suggestion of flight, like a bird frozen mid-sky. She hadn't touched a rotary system in years. Her training was with engines, not airframes. She rebuilt transmissions, not torque tubes. And yet, here she was, face to face, with something that once touched the sky. She wondered who had flown it last, what it had seen, and why it had been abandoned behind a rusting cattle fence out near the county line. She spent the day cataloging what was salvageable. The engine and old Lycoming was seized. The rotor assembly had 2 cracked blade cuffs. The avionics were ancient, mostly analog, and corroded beyond repair. And yet, she couldn't stop smiling. There was something exhilarating about taking inventory of decay. It meant there was something left to fight for. She made a list with her grease-blackened hands, crossing out each component like writing a battle plan. It didn't scare her. Not yet. What scared her was the stillness. The hangar had once been a place of movement. Laughter. Music coming from an old radio balanced on a gas can. Her father used to work here late into the night, sleeves rolled up, hands moving with precision and patience. When he died, she'd tried to keep the place running, fixing cars, taking odd jobs, but the soul of it had vanished with him. This helicopter, as broken as it was, might be her only chance to bring it back. As twilight settled in, she sat on the hangar floor, eating cold noodles from a takeout box, her back against a rusting oil drum. She played a game in her head. Who was the last person to sit in this cockpit? What did they see through that foggy windshield? Did they know it would be their last flight? She stood slowly and climbed into the pilot's seat, feeling the groan of old cushions beneath her. Her hands rested on the cyclic and collective like they still meant something. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel stuck on the ground. 3 days after the helicopter arrived, a stranger knocked on the hangar door. Mallory was elbow deep in the tail rotor assembly, trying to identify the source of a seized bearing when she heard the knock 3 short raps. Then, silence. She wiped her hands on a rag, tucked her hair under her cap, and pulled the door open halfway. Standing there was a man in his 60s, lean, sun-weathered, wearing a denim jacket so old the seams had frayed into white threads. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't unfriendly either. His eyes weren't looking at her. They were fixed on the helicopter behind her, like he'd seen a ghost. "Where'd you find that bird?" he asked. Mallory raised an eyebrow. "Bought her off a rancher out near Hollow Ridge." "Why?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, until the helicopter came fully into view. His face tightened with something halfway between recognition and grief. "I knew it," he said quietly. "I knew she wasn't gone." Mallory watched him for a beat. "You know this helicopter?" The man nodded slowly. "Flew it, fixed it, buried it, thought for good." He reached into his coat and pulled out a weathered leather pouch, the kind pilots used to store maps and flight logs. "Name's Emmett Kane. Used to work this model back when people still believed you could build something worth flying in your backyard." He handed her the pouch like it weighed more than it should. Mallory took it carefully, the leather soft and cracked with time. Inside, she found a logbook, yellowed pages filled with careful handwriting, diagrams, old maintenance schedules. A black and white photo slipped out 2 young men standing in front of the helicopter in its prime, clean lines and bright paint, grins wide like the world hadn't yet broken them. "My brother was the builder," Emmett said. "Did everything from scratch. That helicopter was his obsession, his baby. We called her Sky Moth. Not fast, not flashy, but smooth, safe. She was supposed to be our ticket out of here." Mallory glanced up. "What happened?" Emmett's jaw flexed. He looked away, then back again. "We got 1 flight in. 1. She flew like a dream. Then the FAA got involved. Said she was experimental, unregistered, grounded until further notice. My brother, he never touched her again. She sat under a tarp for decades. When he passed, I couldn't stand to see her rot, so I gave her away. But I never stopped wondering what became of her." Mallory ran her hand over the flight log's embossed cover. "She's here now," Emmett nodded, eyes shining. "And maybe she's finally in the right hands." He stepped back toward the door but hesitated. "If you're serious about bringing her back, there's something you'll want to see. Something we never finished." And with that, he pulled a folded sheet of blue paper from his back pocket and handed it to her. It wasn't a schematic. It was a dream. And she was holding the last unfinished line. The blueprint sat on Mallory's workbench like it was still warm from its creator's hands. Smudged pencil lines, handwritten annotations, a flight control modification that hadn't been part of the original Hughes design. The handwriting matched the notes in the flight log. Crisp, technical, but full of small imperfections that revealed something human. She stared at it for hours that night, long after Emmett left. The hangar buzzed with quiet. A soft hum from the fridge in the corner. Cicadas outside. But inside her, something had begun to stir. It wasn't just fascination. It was responsibility. This machine wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting. The next morning, Emmett returned, this time with coffee and a photo album. They sat at an old steel desk near the hangar's back wall, flipping through pages faded from sun and time. Photo after photo, two young men in their 20s, grinning beside the chopper as it came together piece by piece. The builder Wyatt Kane was tall, wire-framed glasses, hands always smeared with grease, Emmett's older brother. He built her from nothing, Emmett said, voice low and proud. Scavenged parts, re-welded frames, rewrote trim settings by hand. Every inch of her was his story. Mallory turned the pages slowly. One image showed Wyatt standing beside a younger woman holding a folded set of maps. She was laughing, her hair in a braid, face caught in motion. Mallory paused. Who's she? Emmett looked down, and for the first time, a softness crept into his posture. Mara. She was the reason he wanted to fly in the first place. She lived 2 counties over, and he said roads felt like waiting rooms. Flying meant you didn't have to wait. What happened to her? Mallory asked gently. She married someone else, he said after a long pause. Wyatt never really got over it. That chopper was supposed to be the way he won her back. But the grounding crushed him. He never flew again. Stopped building. Started drinking. By the time he passed, the only part of him still in the world was that machine. Mallory listened in silence, absorbing every piece of history like it was part of her own bloodline now. The helicopter wasn't just a project. It was a sealed letter, addressed to a future that never arrived. As the sun dipped behind the hangar windows, Emmett closed the album. I don't think Wyatt ever believed anyone else would care about that bird. But he was wrong. You care. I can see it. Mallory didn't respond right away. She was looking at the control mod on the blueprint. This design, she said, tracing a line, wasn't just experimental. It was brilliant. If we can rebuild this properly, she won't just fly. She'll fly better than she ever did before. Emmett smiled, slow and sad. Then maybe his dream didn't die. Maybe it just waited. Mallory stood, hands on her hips, eyes on the helicopter. Then let's stop waiting. Let's give her back the sky. The following week, Mallory began the teardown. Every bolt she removed, every wire she traced, felt like peeling back layers of someone else's heartbeat. It wasn't just about bringing a machine back to life anymore. It was about preserving a promise, one that had been suspended in time. On the 3rd day of disassembly, she removed the pilot's seat to access the control rods beneath it. The bolts groaned, but gave way. As she lifted the seat from its rust-welded frame, something shifted underneath. A soft thud. Not metal, not parts. Something tucked into the floor pan. She knelt beside the space, heart suddenly loud in her chest. With gloved hands, she pried up a cracked rubber mat. Beneath it, wedged into a hollow compartment, was a flat tin box wrapped in faded blue cloth and sealed with waxed string. She held it up to the light. Dust coated every edge, and the corners were fraying. It didn't look like it had been touched in decades. She hesitated only a second before unwrapping it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a small metal tag, and something wrapped in leather. The paper came first. It was a letter, handwritten in the same script as the flight log, addressed simply, "To whoever is brave enough to finish what I couldn't." Her throat tightened as she read. Wyatt's words were humble, trembling at the edges. "If you're reading this, then you found the part of the bird I never had the nerve to show anyone. This isn't just a helicopter. It's my confession, my prayer, my unfinished mission. I designed a modification to increase lift stability in rough currents, but I never installed it. Not because I couldn't, but because I was afraid of what flying again might make me feel. I left the design in the log. But this," he referenced the next item, a small metal tag, etched with coordinates and a date. "This was where Mara said yes. Not to me, to someone else. I flew over that spot once, knowing she was below, and I nearly landed. But I couldn't. I didn't want to see her happy without me. So I turned back. I told myself the bird wasn't ready. But the truth is, I wasn't. Mallory stared at the tag. The numbers were clear. Longitude, latitude. A patch of empty field, likely long built over. But the pain behind those numbers was still raw, decades later. She opened the last item, a narrow leather case. Inside was a hand-carved medallion, shaped like a compass, but with no needle. Just an engraving. Direction isn't always forward. She sat back against the hangar wall, letter in one hand, compass in the other. The ghost of a man she'd never met was whispering through wires and welded seams. He didn't want to be forgotten. He wanted to be finished. And now, the only thing between his dream and the sky was her. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just whispered to the empty hangar, "I'll take you the rest of the way." The blueprint wasn't just ahead of its time, it was borderline reckless. Wyatt's modification proposed a hybrid rotor articulation system that deviated from the Hughes 300's factory limitations. Mallory spent 2 full nights cross-referencing aviation manuals, scanning FAA articles, and flipping through the old flight logs Emmett had brought over. Every line of the design told her the same thing. This was no amateur's fantasy. Wyatt Kane had been a genius hiding in a shed with tools no one respected. And he hadn't just dreamed of restoring a helicopter, he had designed something meant to outfly its own blueprints. By morning, her coffee was cold, and her mind was on fire. The blueprint wasn't impossible, not completely, but to attempt it meant rewriting part of the aircraft's mechanical soul. There would be no guide, no manual, no second chances if she got it wrong. She stood at the open hangar doors and watched the sun break over the trees. Her hands ached, her stomach clenched with a nervous energy she hadn't felt since the day she took apart her first motorcycle engine at 16. That same question echoed now. Am I really doing this? She taped the blueprint to the wall above her workbench and started a new notebook. Sky Moth, Phase 1. The first task was rebuilding the rotor head to allow for the alternate flex points. That meant machining custom parts, something she didn't have the tools for anymore. She'd sold off most of her precision equipment to buy the helicopter, but she knew someone who did. Mallory drove 2 hours to the edge of Whitlock County, where an old mentor ran a fabrication shop out of a converted grain silo. Henry Clark had hands like anvils, and an attitude like rust slow to budge, but solid beneath the surface. When she told him what she needed, he raised an eyebrow. "You rebuilding a bird, or writing science fiction?" "Bit of both," she replied. He looked at the drawing, then at her. "You're serious?" "I have to be," she said. He nodded once. "Then I'll help you. But if this thing crashes, I don't want my name on it." Deal." Back at the hangar, she marked the fuselage in chalk, laying out every point that needed reinforcement. She stripped the electrical system, rerouted the wiring harness, and began fabricating a new instrument panel from sheet aluminum. Her hands blistered, her knuckles split open, but her spirit hardened. Each cut, each weld, each threaded bolt felt like stitching time back together. Emmett came by with lunch and questions, and sometimes just to sit and watch. He never offered advice unless she asked. He said it was her ship now, her sky. One evening, after 20 straight hours of work, Mallory finally stepped back. The helicopter didn't look finished, but it didn't look broken either. It looked like something becoming, like a story not being retold, but rewritten. She looked up at the blueprint on the wall and whispered, "This is your dream, Wyatt. But we're building it with my hands now." The first one to show up was a kid from the high school, maybe 16, skinny, nervous, holding a welding helmet too big for his face. "I heard you're building a helicopter," he said, voice cracking slightly. "I want to help. I don't know anything yet, but I'm good at learning." His name was Theo, and Mallory had no idea how he found out. But she handed him a broom, pointed to the floor, and said, "Start by making the place look like a shop, not a junkyard." He grinned like she'd just handed him a scholarship. 2 days later, Pete from the hardware store pulled up in his delivery van and dropped off 3 crates of aircraft-grade fasteners and aluminum tubing. "No charge," he said. "That machine deserves the sky." Then came Mrs. Hoyt from the diner, who insisted Mallory and the team eat lunch every day on the house. Fuel for the flight, she winked. Even the local librarian stopped by with a stack of aviation engineering books and an old World War II maintenance manual. Somebody ought to document this, she said. Word spread without flyers, without posts, without even Mallory meaning to tell anyone. It spread because people needed it to. A story worth following. A cause worth lifting. And piece by piece, person by person, the hangar became more than a workspace. It became a town square, an altar, a living memory. Emmett began coming by daily, mostly to supervise, occasionally to lend his hands. He never corrected Mallory's decisions, but when she asked for help, he offered it gently. "You're not Wyatt," he told her once. "You're something different. He built from hope. You build from fire." She wasn't sure if that was a compliment, but she took it anyway. Theo learned to weld under Mallory's guidance. He wasn't perfect, but he listened. Mallory taught him about arc control, wire speed, how to feel the rhythm between the heat and the metal. He picked it up fast. She saw the same hunger in him she once had. The need to prove to someone, maybe just yourself, that your hands could make meaning. Even Father Connors showed up one afternoon in his collar and dusty loafers, asking if he could bless the parts. Mallory raised an eyebrow. "Do they have to be baptized too?" He just laughed and touched a hand to the fuselage. "I've read about miracles. But watching one built from scrap, that's something else." Some helped with their tools, some with their time. Others just brought stories about Wyatt, about Mara, about when helicopters buzzed low over wheat fields in the summer. The hangar filled with the past and the present, grief and joy, oil and purpose. The rust began to disappear, not just from the metal but from the people. Mallory never asked for help. But it came anyway. Not because she was trying to make something fly, but because people saw what she was really doing. She wasn't just rebuilding a helicopter, she was resurrecting belief. It was just after sunrise, when Mallory pulled the hangar doors wide and rolled Sky Moth into the light. The fuselage gleamed under the pale morning sun, painted a deep matte navy with a single silver stripe. Wyatt's original vision, modernized with a few touches of her own. On the tail, just beneath the registration number, she'd stenciled a single phrase in small script. "Direction isn't always forward." Emmett had nodded when he saw it, then turned away before she could catch his eyes. They'd rebuilt every inch rotor system, avionics, the control linkages Wyatt once left unfinished. Theo had machined the new cyclic housing, Mrs. Hoyt's nephew, a drone tech with a side gig in circuit boards, had wired a new GPS overlay into the instrument panel. The original engine had been beyond repair, but a retired mechanic in Jackson donated a rebuilt Lycoming from an old trainer chopper. When it turned over for the first time 2 weeks prior, the entire hangar stood silent, reverent, as if the thing were breathing. Now, the final test had come. Mallory climbed into the cockpit, her hands shaking, breath shallow. Emmett stood off to the side, arms crossed. Theo gave her a thumbs up from behind the safety line. The town had gathered, just a few dozen of them, standing behind a roped-off area near the edge of the field. Someone had brought folding chairs. A kid was eating a breakfast taco like it was a movie, but no one was talking. They were all watching Mallory. She buckled herself in, checked each switch, each dial. The system's check buzzed to life. Oil pressure good, rotor tension within spec, altimeter zeroed. She exhaled, and then she turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught. The hangar echoed with the rising growl of combustion. The rotors began to spin, slow at first, then faster, slicing the air with rhythm and promise. The vibrations ran up her legs, into her spine, into something older than fear. And as the pitch grew, Mallory felt it, that moment between earth and sky when everything inside you says this shouldn't work, but your soul answers, it has to. She lifted the collective, and Sky Moth rose. The crowd gasped. Emmett's hand clenched into a fist. Theo whooped and nearly fell off the folding chair he'd set up as a control tower. Mallory hovered 6 feet above the grass, the rotors steady, the chopper balanced. She held it there for 10 long seconds. The world suspended, the sky remembering the shape of something it had lost. Then, with gentle pressure, she rotated 30 degrees, moved forward, and circled once around the field. The helicopter flew not like a relic, but like something reborn. When she landed, the crowd erupted. Emmett walked to the cockpit, eyes glassy, and said just one thing. He would have cried. Mallory smiled, heart pounding, hands trembling. Me too, she whispered. But she didn't. She had flying to do. The article came out a week after the flight. Front page of the Regional Aviation Journal. Small town mechanic. Rebuilds Sky Moth, a legacy takes flight. Below it, a photo of Mallory standing beside the helicopter, grease on her face, braid tucked under her ball cap, one hand resting on the fuselage like it was a living thing. The story was picked up nationally by the weekend. Requests started flooding her inbox: interviews, speaking engagements, even an offer to display Sky Moth at a museum in Denver. But Mallory ignored most of them. She didn't rebuild the helicopter for fame. She did it to finish something no one else would. Still, when an invitation arrived from the State University's aviation school asking her to speak at a Women in STEM symposium, she didn't say no. Not because she saw herself as a role model, but because, deep down, she remembered being 15, flipping through magazines, wondering if anyone like her ever got to do something big. The day of the event, she wore jeans and boots, grease still under her fingernails, and stood in front of a crowd of young women who looked like they were waiting to believe in something. She didn't have a speech. She just told the truth. I was never the smartest, she said. Never the loudest. I didn't go to college. I barely passed algebra. But I learned how to listen to machines, to people, to the things we leave unfinished. Sometimes all it takes is one person believing a broken thing is still worth saving. After the session, a girl with shaky hands approached and asked if helicopters could be built from scratch. Mallory smiled and said, "Everything can be, if you're stubborn enough." Back home, the hangar was buzzing with life again. Theo was now her apprentice, officially. Emmett still stopped by every Sunday afternoon just to sit and drink coffee in silence. The town called her shop the Nest now, not because it looked like one, but because it had become the place where broken things learned to fly again. Mallory hung the flight log beside her workbench. Next to it, the compass medallion. Below it, a framed version of Wyatt's letter, now yellowing at the corners. Not as a shrine, but as a map. Proof that direction wasn't always forward. Sometimes it looped. Sometimes it landed. Sometimes it handed you blueprints when you expected only scrap. She started a weekend program for girls in the area. Basic engine repair, aviation theory, fabrication. Not so you can fly, she told them, but so you know you could, if you wanted to. She wasn't just a mechanic anymore. She was a translator of dreams, a rebuilder of legacies. She took machines that had been silenced by time and gave them back their voice, and in doing so, she found her own. One evening, Mallory sat inside Sky Moth again. The hangar lights were off, the world quiet. She ran her fingers along the cyclic and whispered into the stillness. You weren't just meant to fly. You were meant to be remembered. It was late autumn when Mallory took Sky Moth up alone for the first time. Not just a hover, not a field loop, but a real flight. She filed a flight plan, double-checked every bolt, and lifted off from the same cracked runway where her father used to test motorcycles in his younger years. The chopper climbed smooth and steady into the blue morning, and for the first time, there was no audience, no camera flashes, no one waiting below with applause. Just her, the controls, and the sky. She flew east over the hills that divided her county from the next, then banked north toward the coordinates etched into Wyatt's metal tag. The air was cool and calm, the kind of quiet that felt almost holy. She passed over wheat fields, barns, a winding river that mirrored the sunlight like it had never aged. And then she saw a clearing framed by tall oaks, the same spot where Wyatt had once flown, heartbroken and hopeful, hovering just out of reach. She circled low, dipped the collective gently, and for a second imagined the younger version of him watching from the ground. The version that never landed. But she did. She touched down for a moment in that open space, pulled the medallion from her jacket pocket, and laid it gently in the grass. No plaque, no ceremony, just a quiet offering between two dreamers, decades apart. On the flight back, something shifted. She wasn't carrying legacy anymore, she was carrying her own story. And it wasn't about restoring what had been, it was about creating what was next. Back in Glenfield, the hangar was changing too. The town had donated funds to expand the space, adding a classroom and new lifts. Theo had recruited 3 more students, and Mrs. Hoyt was working with a nonprofit to bring veterans into the program. The nest had become more than a nickname. It was a community engine. One afternoon, Emmett handed Mallory a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was an old aviation patch that read, "Kane Brothers Experimental." He looked at her and said, "You earned this more than we ever did." She didn't respond, just nodded, hugged him harder than she meant to, and added the patch to the wall beside her father's faded garage sign. The past and future stitched together, side by side. She never took a paycheck from the interviews, turned down the museum's final offer. But she said yes to one thing, a partnership with a nearby flight school to sponsor scholarships for girls who wanted to build, fix, or fly. It was called the Sky Moth Initiative. That evening, Mallory sat in the open hangar, boots up on a crate, watching the last of the sunlight pour through the door. She didn't feel famous. She didn't feel different. She just felt ready. Because sometimes, you don't trade tools for flight, you trade them for freedom. And when you're brave enough to let go of the ground, you find out the sky remembers your name.